This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. And it's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal Podcast. Hello, everyone. Oh, my microphone is not near. I was not totally prepared. Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. Welcome to the Cameron Journal Weekly News Hour and the Cameron Journal Podcast. Thank you guys all for coming. I really appreciate it. It has been a busy time since I saw you last. Let me put my phone away before it inevitably flashes on us. I'm still trying to figure out the right placement for this light. I like this light. And I feel like it adds a little bit of extra ambient lighting to the scene, but unfortunately it also has an awkward glow. So I've been testing how to deploy that light well. And I like the glow from the bottom, but I don't necessarily always like the way it shows up on camera. Anyway, technical detritus, that doesn't matter. Where do we begin? Seriously, where and how do we even start to have conversations this week? Obviously, kind of one of the more stupid news stories that we've been talking about is the whole Bud Light Dylan Mulvaney debacle. What a mess. We have this terrible situation. So Bud Light decided to issue a Pride Month can in colorful rainbow colors and get trans activist person, pop star, all-around media impresario Dylan Mulvaney to endorse the product and do an interesting ad. This has caused a lot of straight white men, including Kid Rock, among others, to completely go nuts. And Kid Rock was pictured shooting up Bud Light products. There have been other videos of people just throwing the stuff out wholesale and going to other things. I heard a story last night from this guy who was posting on TikTok that was like, oh yeah, my I'm a distributor, for alcohol and all this type of thing, and I can't, we sell and distribute Anheuser-Busch products, can't sell them to save our lives right now, and I can't feed my family. This was related to me by someone who had seen it, and it's a difficult thing. I think this is a lot overblown. However, I do think from a branding and marketing perspective, if I were in that meeting, I'd be kind of like, does anyone not understand who the target demo for Bud Light is? Bud Light's going to be fine because gay people drink a lot in volume. Bud Light has, plenty of alcohol content. Although while not being a good beer, they have plenty of alcohol content, all this type of thing. and they'll be fine. They'll be fine. But I think there's going to be a lot of knock-on effects as people don't want to be seen as gay or trans or supporting that by consuming the product. We can have debates on whether that is good or bad, or worthy, we can have conversations um on why these matters always get pressed into a capitalistic context, but the reality is perception is reality. And what, from a branding perspective, what Bud Light has done is they have tied their branding with something that is a very hot political topic right now. And ultimately, for better or for worse, that's going to have negative brand value to them. Now, I think in time, uh, that perception will change. But at least for the near future, probably, literally, probably a couple years, they're going to have some negative brand association with this. So that, I mean, that whole story is a bit of a tempest in a teapot, but it's at least worth saying that. The other story that is less of a tempest in a teapot, actually more important to our lives, is the expulsion of two, and the near expulsion of a third, Tennessee lawmakers who were supporting students in Tennessee protesting in the Tennessee state capitol for gun violence. In fact, one of them, the fellow from Nashville, has already been reinstated by his district's council. So he'll be back on the House floor starting tomorrow. The story has kind of gotten national attention because of the three lawmakers that were protesting with the students. Two of them were black, one of them was white. The two black guys got expelled. The white lady only survived by one vote. And that has that obviously has raised a racial question. It was something that she raised almost immediately during the press conference when she said, when people were asking her, oh, why didn't you get expelled? And she said, I think it has something to do with the color of our skin. I definitely see that. And I'll say she probably started that racial narrative. I don't necessarily know that the racial narrative was in the hearts of the lawmakers, but who were voting for these expulsions. But the reality is that, you know, they made it an over decorum, and that they were not, acting in the in the way that one might approve of for legislators in the Tennessee state legislature. And that would excuse me, for some reason I'm yawning. More caffeine, I think. Anyway, lawmakers will have rallies and do stuff and all this type of thing all the time. What I think the reason why this became such a thing is because, one, it had to do with guns and gun violence, which was the first problem. And two, it also was the matter of who was doing the protesting. Now, and there was also this kind of debate of, well, how come the January 6th situation was an insurrection and these were just protesters? Two different situations. January 6th, you had people entering the Capitol in Washington, D.C. to stop a democratic process of certification of a presidential election. These kids are protesting gun violence. They were in the gallery. They were there when the building was open. That's helpful. Building was open. And they were in public areas where they belong. They were not in people's offices. They were not trying to cart away items from the Tennessee state capitol. All this type of thing. Very different situations. That argument doesn't hold water. The reality is that people are unhappy with the state of gun violence in this country. Some people are unhappy with the state of gun violence in this country. These kids are on the front lines of it because they're the ones in the schools that are getting shot up, and therefore they wanted to make their voices heard, and some legislators, Democratic legislators, stood with them in those efforts, and almost three of them were punished for standing with people with whom they agreed, who were there during a lawful time to be in the building, and who were in the gallery holding signs, having protests, all this type of thing. Now, if the people in the gallery are being disruptive, and that can happen, then the sergeant at arms can send some people up to have those people removed so the legislature can proceed normally. But there is no reason to expel whole members from an assembly because they sided with protesters that you didn't agree with. And I think in the future it's kind of like, okay, if that's why you're expelling people from your legislature, then nobody in your legislature should ever be at a rally or at a protest, whether they agree with it or disagree with it, ever again, because now that it becomes a decorum issue. And I've worked in state government, and so there's lots of these things that are very sticky, and things quickly become a political thing of who likes who doesn't like who agrees with who's in power, who's not, all this. I mean, that's all always a factor, particularly at state government. But this whole thing is pretty ridiculous. I will say, and I think the Tennessee state legislature has certainly acted in bad faith, and I'm glad that the one guy is already getting sent back to the House, and hopefully his compadre from Memphis will get sent back soon as well, so that they can continue to do the work of their constituents. So it's it's an interesting time, interesting situation. Lot going on, lot going on. So, I wanted to dive in to a few news stories that I saw today that I thought were kind of interesting and that we should probably keep an eye on. So, the first one, and this is kind of a twofer a little bit, is you have so there's basically two articles from Business Insider. Um, one, the first one is housing is so unaffordable that banks are losing money for each mortgage they finance for the first time ever. And the other one is how um, millennials are getting squeezed out by cash flush boomers who are buying houses faster and at greater rates than others. And now boomers, because they can offer cash and more money, don't necessarily need a mortgage, all this type of thing, are going crazy with buying houses, and are basically able to beat out millennials who are going to need a mortgage and have already had trouble getting on the property ladder and might just be trying to get their first mortgage, and finally have a down payment together, or they might have gotten a down payment from their family and they're trying to get a mortgage and buy a house, and they're just getting beaten out by older home buyers who have more money. So, but what's interesting is that along with that, you have this sort of weird thing in the housing market. So we'll come back to the boomers and their cash flow situation. Let's start with the why banks are losing money on mortgages. It says here on Business Insider that housing is so unaffordable that banks are losing money for each mortgage they finance for the first time ever. Independent mortgage banks and mortgage subsidiaries of chartered banks lost an average of $301 per loan, the first negative profit recorded by the Mortgage Bankers Association in data going back to 2008. They attribute that largely to the increased cost of financing a loan and decreased housing demand. In 2022, it says here independent mortgage banks. Here we go. This represents a 113% decrease from last year's average income of $2,339 per mortgage, and is the first time that banks posted negative profits for financing home loans since the MBA began reporting profits in 2008. That's largely due to the decrease in housing activity. MBA's Vice President of Industry Analysis Marina Walsh said in a statement, prospective buyers are holding back from the market as mortgage rates hover near a 20-year high and limited housing supply keeps home prices elevated. Banks and other mortgage companies each financed an average of $2.6 billion in loans in 2022, roughly half of the $5 billion figure for 2021. Meanwhile, the cost of financing a loan has gone up. The decline in workers isn't fast enough to make up for the decline in business. Banks and mortgage companies spent an average of $10,624 to finance each home loan in 2022, representing a 23% cost increase from 2021. The rapid rise in mortgage rates over a relatively short period of time, combined with extremely low housing inventory and affordability challenges, meant that both purchase and refinance volume plummeted, Walsh said. The stellar profits of the previous 2 years dissipated because of the confluence of declining volume, lower revenues, and higher costs per loan. Now, with that in mind, we bounce back to boomers beating out millennials for the houses that they're buying. So it says here, when the pandemic rolled around, boomers were able to leverage their economic advantages to jump back into the market like never before. Cash purchases have been on the upswing since the beginning of 2021. This past October, roughly a third of home buyers paid with all cash, the highest share since 2014, according to Redfin. The pivot to cash gave boomers a leg up since they had plenty of home equity to tap. Over the past decade, the average homeowner accrued roughly $210,000 in equity, according to the National Association of Realtors, and as the typical down payment for a home more than doubled during the pandemic, peaking at $66,000 in May of 2022, the ability to use cash savings or the profits from a home sale benefited more senior buyers. During the NAR's last survey period, 51% of older boomers aged 68 to 76 paid with all cash, compared to just 6% of buyers 32 years and younger. That dynamic has played a significant role in the rise of older buyers. So, this is so what have we learned from this little situation? And we have learned the following. One is that companies are losing money on mortgages because housing demand is down and house inventory is non-existent in this country. Conversely, when these trades are being done, it's older buyers with all cash offers that tend to get houses because they have the money to do that younger buyers, except for 6%, simply can't come up with. So you have this weird situation where the housing market is kind of eating itself. Like, it's kind of sort of imploding on only people with a lot of money can participate, and those that might want to can't get a mortgage, but the banks are going to offer fewer mortgages because they're losing money on them because costs have gone up. But there's no chance to, give out more loans because the interest rates are too high and people are sitting on the sideline. Not that they could get a house anyway because they have to finance and they don't have all cash and people are going for all cash. And so it makes it for a situation where if you're trying to find housing right now, if you're trying to buy a house right now, good luck. Good luck. I mean, the market is broken, is really what we've learned here, is the market is broken except for those who are able to pay all cash and who have a lot of money to swing around the housing market. That's the whole game, which means anybody who doesn't, have that money to pay all cash is going to have a hard time getting a loan and and even if they can get a loan, to even then find somebody who's willing to take their offer. Now, the only thing that might change this is if demand goes down so much that it becomes a buyer's market and sellers have to start really incentivizing people to take their house over somebody else's house. But I think we're a while away from that, because as long as you have, cash buyers running around, you have investment companies like BlackRock and all that type of thing floating around doing these all cash offers, you're going to continue to have this sort of broken housing market that really advantages the upper middle class and the wealthy over everyone else, as it has ever been, so it shall ever be. Keeping up in kind of interesting business news, I'm not going to get into it very much, but this is interesting. There's some lawmakers who are asking the Department of Justice to investigate the hollowed out Warner Brothers Discovery merger. So last year, Warner Brothers was bought by Discovery Channel, and the Discovery Channel killed a bunch of the stuff in development, took a bunch of stuff off HBO Max so they didn't have to pay out residuals to actors and crew. They also, just really kind of took everything Warner Brothers was working on and killed most of it. And their changes over at HBO Max were complained about by a lot of people. All this type of thing. Well, now this is kind of this is garnering some government scrutiny to find out if what Discovery has done is anti-competitive or antitrust in any way. All as Discovery is trying to cut costs and reduce expenses by $3.2 billion. So I thought that was interesting. The DOJ approved the merger. The antitrust division approved the merger. So I thought that was interesting. And it's kind of interesting once a merger has been approved and has gone through for the government to go back and re-evaluate it. Do I think they're going to force Warner Brothers and Discovery to divest and spin it off? Possibly, but I doubt it. It's a lot of political posturing that will end up going nowhere. Another interesting story that I thought was interesting is FedEx is overhauling their whole operation, and they're looking at moving all of their drivers to being independent contractors and getting rid of overlapping routes so that they are more efficient and save more money. Now, this story was kind of interesting in that the article actually mentions one of the chief things most people don't know about FedEx. So FedEx, all the ground drivers, most of them are independent contractor service providers, and a lot of the guys who do FedEx routes actually buy their route. So they're basically like their own one-man parcel service who happens to be delivering for FedEx Ground. They might drive around in a FedEx Ground truck and all this type of thing, but if you look at the real small print down on the bumper, you'll see that they're actually their own entity just under the FedEx brand because that's who they're delivering for. UPS is different, and the article, I was surprised, actually mentions this. It says the move would draw a sharp contrast with rival United Parcel Service, which has long earned higher margins, even with a fleet of highly paid, unionized staff drivers. At a time of waning e-commerce and economic uncertainty, FedEx aims to put shareholder returns ahead of its previous growth mindset. They actually said the truth. On Bloomberg, they actually said, the company that pays their workers better and is unionized and all this type of thing is making more money than the fly-by-night independent contractor, let's put shareholder returns ahead of growth sort of thing, is actually working better. That's a huge achievement. A huge, 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 huge achievement. And that is one of the reasons I want to talk about this story, but also because I have said, and this was just posted on the Cameron Journal where I talked about how I predicted the gig economy in 2014. This independent contractor, nobody on staff model has been becoming very popular throughout the whole economy for years. This is Tyson outsourcing its chicken farming. FedEx is well known for having done this for package delivery. And the fact that they're leaning into that, not away from that, when you have another business case, their immediate competitor does not work that way, I think is going to be a real test of whether this outsourcing, everyone's a contractor, everyone works for themselves, don't have employees, cut costs anywhere and everywhere you can, is even going to work. And it says here, interestingly enough, when FedEx bought a trucking business in 1998, Smith insisted it remained, that was Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, remain a distinct operation, giving rise to the ground unit. Unlike Express, which was by air, the new business line stuck to road-based routes plied by contract drivers. To customers, there was little distinction. Both staff and contract drivers wear FedEx-branded uniforms and operate trucks with the logo on the side. In practice, it gave people a cheaper but slower alternative while giving FedEx more flexibility. It also meant that the ground and express units didn't coordinate with each other, sending staff and non-staff drivers on overlapping routes and duplicating costs for such things as finance department and back office work. UPS, by contrast, has always operated a single network, even after beginning air express service in 1988 to counter FedEx. Despite having a unionized fleet of drivers, UPS has consistently outpaced the company by profitability as it capitalizes on the efficiencies of its network. Since Carol Tome took over as CEO in 2020, UPS has widened its adjusted operating margins to 13.8% for 2022, compared to just 6.1% for FedEx. The moral of the story, I think FedEx is going to shoot itself in the foot. I think FedEx is gonna blow it. They're going to do something stupid, make a stupid decision, whatever have you, and not realize that the power of any company is the people in the trucks on the ground doing the work. I think they could take a note out of FedEx's book and have real employees, have people on staff, fix their routes, and coordinate better with air and ground, and get so many network efficiencies out of that they could actually afford to keep their employees on. Instead, they're probably going to end up with some hybrid of, let's cut back on employee costs and all this type of thing. Let's only make our route somewhat more efficient. And they'll end up just kind of bumbling into some sort of solution that doesn't really work for anybody. And I say that because in the past, when there have been reorganizations at FedEx, that's exactly what they've done. And there's nothing indicating that's going to be any different this time. Another story that kind of broke this morning, last night, but this morning really, was highly sensitive classified documents were leaked, Pentagon says. It says here, highly sensitive classified information was made public in a leak of documents that provided details of U.S. spying on other countries, including an assessment of weaknesses in Ukraine's military, and pose, quote, a very serious risk to national security, according to the Pentagon. The Department of Defense is, quote, working around the clock to figure out the scope and scale of the distribution of the information and its veracity, spokesman Chris Meager told reporters Monday. It is highly classified sensitive material that people in DoD and certainly other aspects of U.S. government use to inform their work. He said the U.S. has engaged at high levels with allies on the leak. At the White House, John Kirby, spokesman for the National Security Council, said, "We truly don't know whether more documents will be released." While the Pentagon conducts a damage assessment, the Justice Department has opened a criminal investigation. "We have been in communication with the Department of Defense related to this matter and have begun an investigation," the department said in a statement. "We decline further comment." The secret documents appeared on social media sites in recent weeks. The materials reveal information on a wide range of topics, from U.S. assessments of the war in Ukraine to intelligence gathered on diplomatic allies. President Joe Biden was first briefed on the leak last week. "When we all got word that there were some documents out there, and he has stayed briefed, remained in contact with national security officials throughout the weekend," spokesman Kirby said at the White House. Biden administration officials expect the leak to come up in the course of their regular contacts with allies, including in person when Biden meets in the UK later this week with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. The UK and US are members of the Five Eyes group that shares some of their most sensitive intelligence, as are Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. One European official said the problem is mostly the messages conveyed by the leaked material, such as public confirmation that the U.S. spies on allies, including Ukraine, and the implication that time may be on Russia's side in its invasion because of Ukraine's shortage of munitions and the limits of its air defenses. I don't think anything particularly exciting is going to come from that. I tried looking for some of the material. I couldn't really find it, at least not easily, so... But, thanks to Reportage, we know what they was talking about, so that's always handy and helpful. So that, I mean, is it awkward? Yes. Is it going to be a problem? No. Will the DOJ probably go and arrest somebody for doing this? If they can find them. It's interesting that they don't necessarily have an idea of how the information got out and who did the leaking or who posted it or anything like that. This could be a state actor. I imagine at that level of security it would be. It also could be a hacker who has been hired by a state actor for plausible deniability. So, like, one of the things China likes to do is they like to hire one of, some of their super smart math whiz kids to go do the dirty work for them in, like, North Korea or some place kind of away, so that China can say, "Oh no, Whatever are you talking about? We don't know them, even though they've been paid for by the Chinese government and all this type of thing. That we know from my research in cybersecurity and other documentaries that China has a habit of doing that. This could be that. I'm not saying that that's we don't have that information yet, but that is a possibility. That there is a state actor behind this, either contracting a hacker, or in the case of Russia, because they like to keep things in house, if it was like Russia, it could be a direct attack sort of thing. It'll be interesting to see how that story develops as time goes on, but I would keep an eye on that one as well. We're going to get back to the international angle in a moment. This next story, this is another one. Been saying it's coming for a while. A 1.5 trillion wall of debt is looming for U.S. commercial properties. It says office retail property valuations could fall as much as 40%. Almost 1.5 trillion, it says here, almost 1.5 trillion of U.S. commercial real estate debt comes due for repayment before the end of 2025. The big question facing those borrowers is, who's going to lend to them? Refinancing risks are front and center for owners of properties from office buildings to stores and warehouses. Morgan Stanley analysts, including James Egan, wrote in a note this past week, the maturity wall here is front-loaded, so are the associated risks. The investment bank estimates office and retail property valuations could fall as much as 40% from peak to trough, increasing the risk of defaults. According to The Headache, small and regional banks, the biggest source of credit to the industry last year, have been rocked by deposit outflows following the demise of Silicon Valley Bank, raising concerns that will crimp their ability to provide finance to borrowers. The wall of debt is set to get worse before it gets better. Maturities climb for the coming 4 years, peaking at $550 billion in 2027, according to the Morgan Stanley note. Banks also own more than half of the agency commercial mortgage-backed securities, bonds supported by property loans and issued by U.S. government-sponsored entities such as Fannie Mae, including their exposure to the sector. The role that banks have played in this ecosystem, not only as lenders but also as buyers, will compound the wave of financing coming due. Ever since work from home became popular in 2020, I have been saying we are going to have a commercial debt problem at some point because there is whole portfolios, especially invested by pension funds, all this type of thing, and mortgage-backed securities that depend on commercial real estate, which is seen as much more stable than residential, commercial real estate, all this type of thing. And if that breaks, and that process was broken by the pandemic, eventually that debt could be worth nothing because the real estate, the underlying real estate, which is the underlying store and producer of value, becomes worth much less. And so when they're talking 40% valuations, if you're own some commercial property and it's worth $1 million today, a drop of 40% is going to drop you down to $600,000. Now, if you have a mortgage for, say, $1.5 million and you need to refinance, you no longer have the value to refinance that loan, which means you're going to be stuck paying the loan at the terms you already have and paying on a property on which you're underwater because you owe more debt on it than the property is worth, so you can't even sell it to get out from the debt. And this problem is so big, it's a $1.5 trillion problem, and these dominoes are going to start falling, and as the article mentioned, it's going to contribute to our banking crisis that's not a banking crisis, because all of a sudden, you're going to have people defaulting on mortgages, the bonds that are sold as those mortgages are packed together as part of securitization will be worth less, so the bank's losing money two ways. It's losing money on its loan portfolio, it's losing money on its bond portfolio, at the same time as valuations continue to fall. And when you don't have, though, that capital available, the bank then has to go out and raise money, or the bank cannot meet its obligations, and then the bank goes under. And then the government has to step in. And we've already seen this with First Republic getting quickly sold off, Signature and SVB going under. This could get a whole lot worse before it gets any better, which is why I think it's disingenuous that the Fed does not describe this as a banking crisis, because ultimately, that's what we're in the middle of. A banking crisis. And the sooner we get more honest about that, and the sooner we understand that we have some real economic issues ahead, the better off we'll all be. Now, turning in our final story to the international angle one more time. So Macron has been up to interesting things. Emmanuel Macron was recently in China, and in this Politico story, he it is the political. He ended up talking to reporters on the flight back from China, and he said that he emphasized his pet theory of strategic autonomy for Europe to become a third superpower, so that Europe does not become America's follower. He said the great risk Europe faces is that it gets caught up in crises that are not ours, which prevents it from building a strategic autonomy, while flying from Beijing to Guangzhou in southern China aboard France's Air Force One. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have enthusiastically endorsed Macron's concept of strategic autonomy, and Chinese officials constantly refer to it in their dealings with European countries. Party leaders and theorists in Beijing are convinced the West is in decline and China is on the ascendant, and that weakening the transatlantic relationship will help accelerate this trend. The paradox would be that, overcome with panic, we believe we are just America's followers, Macron said in the interview. The question Europeans need to answer: is it in our interest to accelerate a crisis on Taiwan? No. The worst thing that would be to think that we Europeans must become followers on this topic and take our cue from the US agenda and a Chinese overreaction. Just hours after his flight left Guangzhou, headed back to Paris, China launched large military exercises around the self-ruled island of Taiwan, which China claims as its territory, but the U.S. has promised to arm and defend. Beijing has repeatedly threatened to invade in recent years and has a policy of isolating the democratic island by forcing other countries to recognize it as part of one China. And then they go on to talk about the conversations that Winnie the Pooh, Xi Jinping, has had with Macron, and it says here that stability in the Taiwan Strait is of paramount importance. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who accompanied Macron for part of his visit, said she told Xi during their meeting in Beijing last Thursday, the threat of the use of force to change the status quo is unacceptable. Xi responded by saying that anyone who thought they could influence Beijing on Taiwan was deluded. Macron appears to agree with that assessment. Europeans cannot resolve the crisis in Ukraine. How can we credibly say on Taiwan, watch out, if you do something wrong, we will be there? If you really want to increase tensions, that's the way to do it, he said. Europe is more than willing to accept a world in which China becomes a regional hegemon, said Yamei Zhe, geopolitics analyst at Gavakal Dragonomics. Some of its leaders even believe that such a world order may be more advantageous to Europe. In his trilateral meeting with Macron and von der Leyen last Thursday in Beijing, Xi Jinping went off the script and laid two topics, Ukraine and Taiwan, according to someone who was present in the room. Xi was visibly annoyed for being held responsible for the Ukraine conflict, and he downplayed his recent visit to Moscow, this person said. He was clearly enraged by the U.S. and very upset over Taiwan, by the Taiwanese president's transit through the U.S., and the fact that foreign policy issues were being raised by Europeans. In this meeting, Macron and von der Leyen took similar lines on Taiwan, this person said, but Macron subsequently spent more than 4 hours with the Chinese leader, much of it with only translators present, and his tone was far more conciliatory than von der Leyen's when speaking with journalists. And obviously the big part of this story, because it goes on, is Europe paying for and being responsible for its own defense. And the reality of the situation is that if Macron wants to lead Europe into strategic autonomy, one, they should have a cheeky chat with their friends the Germans about that, and see what that might look like in terms of how that's going to work. And also, I think they also should have a cheeky chat and a cheeky idea about what that is going to mean for their relationship with the U.S. and their dependence on our Navy, our military. I mean, France has a functional military in a way that Germany does not. Britain, when it was part of the EU, led some extra military gravitas because the UK and France could take care of most problems. They're really the only two European powers that can project any power overseas. With Britain kind of out of the picture on its own, and them trying to figure out what they're going to do with the other 27 members of the EU, in order for that policy to mean anything, they're going to have to start arming up and getting their defense house in order. I think there's also an aspect of this where France is going to have some campy conversations about social program spending, which European nations have been able to spend lavishly on social programs and have early retirement ages because they're not spending it on defense. And if they're going to increase those things, they're going to have to increase, taxes, which is also can present a problem long term. They also have demographic issues as well. I think it's interesting that Macron, seeing a US-China conflict over Taiwan coming down the road, is already trying to create distance. I think it's interesting that Macron wants to create distance while the his EU partner, van der Leyen, EU Council President, was trying to not do that so much. It might say that there's a little bit of a disagreement in between Brussels and Paris, about what exactly the policy the European Union is going to take towards China and Taiwan is going to be. And I think that that is fascinating. That is fascinating as well. So it is, I think, the idea that China is trying to create a wedge between the United States and Europe, obviously for China, is good news. I get why they would try to achieve that goal. That makes rational sense. The fact that Macron is trying to create distance in a way that the European Union as an institution is not, even though France is arguably the EU's most powerful member without Britain, I think is interesting. Very interesting. And I think the Taiwan question, with it being the hot topic, especially with Ukraine, with the war in Ukraine grinding onward, and this leak and all this type of thing, is going to raise some serious geopolitical issues and messes, both between adversaries and between allies. As someone said, we're returning to the world we had before World War I. And I think that's all, as we kind of read about these topics and think about these topics and all this type of thing, I think that's a good perspective to keep. So, well, it's 5:42. I usually wrap this up at about the 15 to the hour. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming and watching the Cameron Journal News Hour. We had a lot of viewers this time. I was looking at the number down here. And we had a lot of people watching this time, which I love and appreciate. And I know this is really popular, and I'm so glad that you guys were able to come watch. And I'm glad that I'm able to do it again now that school is over and I'm officially an MFA. I actually have time to do the weekly news hour, and it's one of my favorite things to do. So it's a lot of fun. This week on the Cameron Journal, we have a lot of interesting things. We have some stuff about the train accident in East Palestine. We have some new literature stuff that's happening as well. I also have a big thing I've been working on. I'm on J.P. Sears that's coming out next weekend. So there's a lot of stuff on the Cameron Journal this week, and we love it. And we love it and we appreciate it. And so make sure to check us out at CameronJournal.com. All right, I'm going to quit rambling because I'm not saying anything productive. So thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it, and we'll see you next week. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal Podcast.